So welcome to the space today, everybody. I wanted to start our time today just by taking a moment to mention that this talk is actually co-hosted by the University of the Fraser Valley and the Reach Gallery Museum. Each institution is a grateful guest on Sochtemoc, the traditional unceded territory of the Stalo peoples. And I'm joining today's talk today, connecting with you from the traditional unceded territory and gathering place of the Kwantlen, Kikite, Coquitlam, Stalo, Katsi, and Musqueam peoples. And I just want to let everybody know that I'm very thankful to be living and working here. And I invite everybody to take a moment to recognize the places that you are living and working within so that we can begin today's talk in a good way. And before we get rolling, I also want to take this opportunity to introduce everyone to Emily Neufeld. Emily Neufeld is our artist joining us today. Emily was born in Alberta on Treaty 6 and 7 land, and now lives and works on the unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam, in what is now called North Vancouver. Her practice investigates place and how humans change and are changed by the surrounding environment and the layers of memory and psychic history that accumulate in our material world. She is informed by her Mennonite and Scottish colonial history and centers that framework in her understanding of place and her relationship to these stolen lands. In addition to collaborative projects with other artists, recent solo exhibitions include Prairie Invasions, a Lullaby in 2020 at the Richmond Art Gallery in Richmond, BC, Before Demolition, Tides, 2019 at the Eye Level Gallery in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Motherlands, The Pole, and Den Haag, I believe that's the Netherlands, and Before Demolition, 2017 at the Burrard Arts Foundation. Neufeld has created and participates in community sharing gardens and sees land as a fundamental component to her research process. She received her BFA from Emily Carr University of Art and Design in 2013. And folks, I just want to take a moment to express my gratitude for Emily joining us today. We're so excited to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be with you.
So feel free, Emily, we had talked about kind of starting with a bit of a slightly more traditional look at like some of your work. So please feel free to share screen and roll in whenever you're ready.
All right. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. Yeah, I'm just going to start off by giving you like a, medium brief sort of walk through my practice to date. And then Amy and I will sort of have a little bit more of a chat after that about some of the themes and ideas that kind of keep coming up in my work. And then we'll move into questions. So yeah, I'll start off with just a classic artist talk here and show you some of my work. So yeah, I started making work in homes, and I actually started working in homes that had been abandoned on the prairies back in 2010 or so. I would go and take photographs in these kind of empty farm houses that are all across the prairies, but particularly still a lot remain in eastern Alberta, and western Saskatchewan is where I was exploring. A lot of these houses are on farmland that has been aggregated into larger and larger holdings by agribusiness farms. So they're now the houses that were on every quarter section. Now the farms are being farmed, by way larger sections because of agribusiness and these bigger ways of farming. So these little houses that were the old original farmsteads or farmsteads built in the 50s, 60s, 70s are now often abandoned, and they have no value. So they're just sort of left because they can't be sold, and they're way in the middle of nowhere. So there's lots and lots of these houses across the prairies. They're getting fewer and fewer every year, but still there are quite a lot that are just left empty across the prairies. And I loved as a child and as a teenager, we would drive around and find them nearer to the bigger cities. Now they're starting to disappear because the land has got value. But if you go out um, to where there's no cities and no towns, nobody really wants to live way out there. So these houses are just sort of left abandoned. And I would explore them and think up stories of the people who might have lived there and kind of like poke around, scavenge things, take photos, and then make sculptures that kind of looked like this. So there's a lot of building materials and a lot of soils. There's always soil cast into things because I'm thinking about the land and what land has value and why these houses are, abandoned, and other houses like here in Vancouver are worth way more than they should be, kind of a thing. So there's this sort of is my early exploration into this stuff. This is some of the work I made as I was finishing up my degree at Emily Carr. So then I was traveling back and forth to the prairies, taking photographs, exploring these houses, and then making sculptures in my studio. And I was outside of a house, and I was sketching a house when it was being demolished here in North Vancouver. And as we all know that like around 2013, 2014, I mean, even up till today, houses are being demolished and infill homes put in at a very rapid pace in North Vancouver in my neighborhood. And so I was sitting sketching while the like big backhoe was knocking down a house. And the neighbor came out and was talking to me about how that house was actually the home that Bryan Adams first started his garage band in. And, it was being knocked down. Now there's a big, giant McMansion thing on that piece of land. And I was thinking to myself, like, it's kind of a funny, weird little piece of North Van trivia, but also just like that I wondered about how, like, if Bryan Adams were to come back to this neighborhood, would he really be able to identify which house he had started that garage band in, because the physical house is gone and now there's a new house in its place. And it got me thinking about like how our memory is so tied to location. And even if even the 10 years that I've lived in this neighborhood, so much has changed. But if I walk down the street, I'm not always able to like identify exactly what that house used to look like. Like I already forget, and how our memory is so tied up in physical things. So it made me think, why am I flying back to the prairies so regularly? There's plenty of plenty of interesting homes that are being abandoned, or demolished here in Vancouver, which has got an interesting tie to the same kind of, like, it's all about this like land value, whether that means it's not valuable because no one wants to live there, whether it's too valuable because everyone wants to live there, and what the land is used for, in the prairies with the farming, and then, here in Vancouver, it's a lot of like real estate spectatorship, and it, just sort of always comes back to this land. So I started to get permission to go into these homes that were slated for demolition and make sculptural interventions into them in one way or another before they were torn down. So there's like usually a 5-day window from when the blue fencing goes up. The person has to go out, and they do like hazardous materials testing. So they'll come in and take samples, and they have to go back and make sure that everything is like asbestos and free before they knock the house down. So during that short window of like 5 to 6 days, when they're doing the testing, the hazmat testing, I can kind of sneak in and do some like interventions into the house. So in this house, it was this old carpet, and I cut where the people had walked in the house, where you could see the pattern of where they had walked, and I cut that carpet away to reveal this bright blue undercushion underneath. My original plan was to cut right down to the flooring, to the subfloor underneath, but the undercushion was such a nice contrast to the pink that I stopped at the undercushion. So I started making these works, in these homes that were slated for demolition, cutting into them, altering them in some way, kind of, looking. It was a process of, you go in and you kind of like look around and you sort of try to feel for some kind of presence, and then you making an intervention into the house. And then I was able to show these works this was the wall on the outside of the CBC building in downtown, where I was able to do this large scale, 30-foot by 40-foot billboard called The Wall that's with the Vancouver Heritage Foundation and the CBC and JJ Bean. So I took two images from one of the houses I worked in where there was this beautiful mural on the wall, but you could see the pattern of where the furniture had been up against the wall. So it was like all the rest of the mural was faded, but you can sort of see the bright orange in the two corners there where there was furniture up against it, and there was some this painted stripe was in the house, and I just carried it through the rest of the house and then out the window to the actual view. And I just thought it was interesting how there's this fake view and then a real view, and sort of exploring that, and the way we think of space and use space, and kind of contain nature to within these like boxes of windows or murals or artworks, and we try to like really contain it. And then this is the show at the Broad Arts Foundation that was kind of the culmination of this work in these homes slated for demolition. I printed out the images from the houses onto these very like life-sized vinyl stickers, and I put them on the gallery walls and then combined them with the sculptures that I made using the housing materials and building materials to kind of make like the figures. So the building materials become like the people in the space, and trying to give the viewer the same feeling that I had when I was wandering around these houses that were slated for demolition. So these are some of the images from that show. That's a rammed earth carpet runner I put in the gallery there. And these sort of figurative sculptures with this contained nature in the form of the sod up on top, and the carpet that I cut out of the house. And again, the figures. And the flooring there is made of like pieces of baseboard and 2x4 and trim and a door that came out of all these houses. But when you walk on it, you get this real physical sensation of kind of rolling across a floor. So you kind of, it gives your body that same kind of sensation of a creaky old floor or a unstable kind of a flooring. And yeah, these three images were kind of at the beginning of the gallery as sort of almost like a gesture to contextualize the rest of the show, so you can sort of see that the images are coming from these homes. They're a little more classic photos that sort of situate the rest of the gallery exhibition. So this is actually right when you first came in, with this one sculpture that is sort of these inverted building materials where the soil is actually on top. And then it goes down to the like finishing things like the curtains that are sort of seen as like the more decorative things are kind of on the bottom, but they're also the soft materials that are kind of holding up the whole thing. So there's some interesting gravitational things happening there. Yeah, and then this piece is a little bit of a like a change in what I'm kind of like exploring here, but it's still quite linked. And I wanted to show this work because this is the work that I showed at the Reach Gallery just this last fall. So this is a flag that I commissioned a master weaver, Soledad Munoz, to weave this flag for me, which is actually a flag with a satellite map of Europe on it. It's a jacquard weave. So you can sort of, if you look at the kind of the bottom there, you can sort of see the like boot shape of Italy kind of at the bottom there. And what I did was in Abbotsford, I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure of visiting the Mennonite Museum, but I have Mennonite heritage, and I went into the Mennonite Museum and was able to simply give them my name, and they printed off for me my family tree back to 1580. And I got 50 sheets, just a stack of my family tree with every known relative on both of my Mennonite grandparents' side, all the way back to 1580 in Amsterdam. So I was able to trace my father, who's my Mennonite side's ancestry, all the way back. And so I wove this map of Eastern Europe mostly, and I embroidered and I wove my own hair into it along with the darker streaks you see in there is my hair. So my hair is woven into the design. And then I embroidered in this embroidery thread my family's travels through Europe. So Mennonites were Anabaptists, and they were persecuted by the Catholic majority at the time. And so my ancestors started in Amsterdam. There's quite a few Dutch, German, Swiss, even some Swedish Mennonites who then kind of had to flee from persecution, and they all went into Poland. So you can trace exactly which villages my family lived in Poland. And then in Poland, Poland asked them to either pay taxes or do military service, and the Mennonites were unwilling to do either. So they then fled to Russia, where they were actually instrumentalized to steal land away from the Cossack people, who had this really beautiful farmland, and they were trying to fight for independence as well. But Russia didn't want them to separate. So instead, they just took their land and gave it to the Mennonites. And the Mennonites farmed that land. But the deal was that they were like, but we want to be just like left alone here. We want to educate our own children. We want to do our own farming. We don't want to do taxes or military service. And Catherine the Great agreed to that. But then, by the late 1800s, they were given basically it was a reserve. They were given a certain amount of land. And as they kept breeding and making more and more Mennonites, there was not room within that land to support all the people. So waves of Mennonites started to move to Turtle Island, or North America as it's so called, and be given land there to farm. So this is sort of the journey of my family, which exactly mirrors that. So I embroidered that into the flag, and then I dyed the land parts of the flag, of the map, with soil from my mom's, like my family farm in Alberta. So there's sort of this, and then the flag went back to Amsterdam, and it was flown at a gallery on this flagpole. So the idea is then the soil from my family farm and my own DNA that's in my hair is dropping back into the soil in the Netherlands, and it's sort of this cycle. Also, I should mention that Mennonites in Russia did farm silk. So this flag is woven out of cultivated silk, which is just weird that I had never heard that until I was doing research for this project, that Mennonites had farmed silk, which is apparently quite a stinky thing. So their clothes would smell like the silk worms, and they would be a little bit ostracized in society for that. So this flew in Amsterdam, and then it came back, and I was able to show it in Abbotsford at the Reach Gallery. So this is how it was exhibited at the Reach Gallery, with this cast soil pile that also has some of my hair in it underneath the flag. And you can see the flag is much more hairy now that it's flown already in Amsterdam. And then there's this photo of me with my hair in the soil behind the flag. And the two arms that are holding it up are cast pieces of wood that came from garden beds that were starting to rot. So I pulled them off of my own garden beds, and they were already starting to rot. And so I cast them, which is sort of all about the cycle of entropy and freezing the cycle of entropy, where as things are breaking down, even our stories, our histories of our own lives are kind of breaking down and changing and morphing. And we try to freeze it by writing it down or by taking a photograph. But, the memory or the facts kind of still, they lose some of their, the reality kind of starts to slip away no matter what you do, kind of a thing. So yeah, so it still is connected to these ideas of memory and about trace and history and place, but just in a slightly different form, using this map instead of a domestic home or something. So yeah, this is another house I did. That this is a fishing shack in Cape Breton that was going to be knocked down, and I got the opportunity to make work in it before it was. So I flew out there, and remember when we could fly places? Oh, so nice. Anyways, I got to fly out there, and I actually cut the pattern of the tides into the side of the house, because it right to the left of this photo is actually the ocean, like the bay. So this was a fisherman shack right on the water. And so the only like land I could sort of see, the only, because I'm often working with the land in relationship to the house, was sort of the bay right there in the fishing bay. So I cut in the tide pattern into through the house, and then the straighter line that kind of cuts through the tide, if you can sort of see there, is the moon phase. So I started at the door. You can see to the right of the door. When I arrived, it was at a 1/4 moon, and by the time I left, it was at a 3/4 moon, and the tide pattern kind of matches that. So I was there for 2 weeks, um, and you can see sort of how the phase of the moon really changes the extremity of the tides. Which, being a prairie girl, this was kind of like an amazing visualization for me to see that, like how the moon exactly affects the tides. So yeah, this is the inside. And then I took a time lapse video of this and was able to show it at a gallery in Halifax. So yeah, and then this work is sort of related to the before demolition. But then I went back to the farmhouses, to the abandoned farmhouses across Alberta and Saskatchewan. And this is a body of work I made in 2018 and then just exhibited this fall as well at the Richmond Art Gallery. So, I would go and make interventions into the house. There was a wallpaper on this wall. I'm copying the wallpaper pattern, but using flowers and plants that I found in the ditches. So these are brown-eyed Susans and poplar leaves and grasses that were just growing in the ditch nearby. And so I'm copying the wallpaper pattern, which the wallpaper had like roses and peonies and sort of, plants that would have come over from Europe. And I'm here using more plants that are native to North America here to kind of copy the pattern. Here we've carried the sod. There was a hole in the ceiling here, and there was moss growing, and so we just carried sod up from the yard and put sod down wherever there was moss to sort of. And it's a little hard to tell. You have to kind of notice the window that we're on the second floor here. So eventually this house will fall, and this sod will kind of come back down, and it's just kind of wild grasses and poplar trees that are growing here. This floor was like super about to collapse, so it was a little scary walking across it. I had to find where the joists were underneath the floor and walk kind of along that line for fear of falling through. But yeah, and this house we found with these holes kind of in the wall already. So I just put, again, the kind of natural elements that I found in the farmyard. In the grasses here, there's a rock side, this branch. There's some on this little straight at the back there's a pile of just grass seeds on a shelf that I kind of made. So I kind of make these interventions into these spaces while I'm visiting. And then I take these large photos and I exhibit the work this is the work from the Richmond Art Gallery. So this is some objects I found within houses. This light fixture that had the birds' nests on it was almost like too good of a find. It was almost like so good that I wasn't sure if I could even find a way to use it. Barn swallows are a population that was originally lived in like caves, and so there weren't very many of them because there's not that many caves and homes. And with agriculture, their population just exploded. They come from Eastern Europe kind of area, as well as when their population really exploded. And because when you farm, you provide them with bugs and food source and all of that. And then with the kind of more agribusiness now, where everything is a monocrop and more spraying for bugs, and all the barns that used to be on every quarter section, now there's only one every 4 or 5 sections. So their population is actually in decline, and they're on the not endangered list, but the at-risk list in Canada. And I just think it's super interesting to think about where we count from. Why do we count from the height of a species population, as opposed to when they were maybe doing not as well, or there's this major climb, and then that's where we start to worry that they're in decline. It kind of, to me, mirrors this concept of farming and how we romanticize sort of farming life, but actually it was very difficult life, and especially for women, very isolated kind of on these farms. So yeah, I sort of was mirroring in my mind the barn swallows with the farming peoples. And so this table became kind of, this is the hub of a farmstead, is the kitchen table. Um, and here I've again cast soil, and these are native prairie grasses that are growing in them. And I'm talking about, like, these are sort of also talking about topsoil. So this one, it's half topsoil before it gets into what they call the B level. So there's the O level, which is the organics on top of them. The A level of soil is like your topsoil, and then you get to the B level, which is a little bit more difficult. So depending on how deep that level is how successful often your farm is, or what kinds of things can grow. So this one in the foreground here has got, only about a foot of topsoil, and then the one near the back there has got more. So sort of three different heights of topsoil there, and the ways different plants can grow in them. So, and then these larger photos are how I sort of showed the work. So after making the sculptural interventions into the space, then I take the photos, print them out, and make them into sculptures as well. So these three light boxes I made they're panoramas, but they're panoramas that fold like the wrong way. They kind of go away from, like, normally you're encapsulated within the environment, and this is you have to walk around it with your body to sort of see. And then I've also printed off other photographs just to this 8-foot by 12-foot wall size, so that it becomes like the scale of you standing in the space as well. So again, trying to kind of activate the viewer's body to have the same feelings that I had when I was in those spaces. So this is the Richmond Art Gallery show, just another view of it. And then on the backs of each of these photo walls, I treated them all a little differently as sculptures as well. So this one has the barn swallow nests kind of in with the prairie grasses. And then you can see within the prairie grass, I've also put in these Rudbeckia, or the brown-eyed Susans. So the grass, every single piece in this show has got a repeating motif of the grass somewhere in it. So yeah, I'm sort of really thinking about the native species versus introduced species versus invasive species, and kind of what it means to be a guest. Like, we are in a process of evolution, and species do move around the planet. I think we have extremely accelerated that with like human intervention, but things do move and things do change. But the question is how to be a good guest versus how to kind of, or being an invasive guest where, you take over or you destroy the other things that were living there before you. And so these are a lot of the kind of questions that I sit in as a, the child of colonizers, and like a continued colonizer myself, as someone who lives on lands where the treaties aren't being upheld, or where the land is unceded, and just kind of how to complicate our kind of thinking about that, and kind of draw some parallels and think about the land and how we're using it, and who we're listening to when it comes to how the land is being used as well. Our politicians have one agenda, and there's a whole bunch of other people we should be kind of listening to. So yeah, that kind of leads me up to the work that I'm doing now. I'm moving over into doing some research into resource extraction in British Columbia in particular. I think that the way that resource extraction communities are built versus farming communities is kind of an interesting parallel and contrast as well, where resource extraction is often single men who kind of go off and they're going to stake their claim and then come back, or whereas farming is very communal. You need the women and the children and the grandparents, and everybody kind of needs to work together. And so, the resource extraction people don't tend to like buy into the community, so they don't take as much care maybe, because they're just planning on grabbing and taking off after it's done. But at the same time, with a lot of mining, there's a lot more sort of integration into the First Nations communities or the Chinese communities that are also in BC, because people kind of need each other and they don't have a community of their own. So I'm starting to research into that, and that'll be kind of my next subject that I'm going to kind of look at. But in the meantime, thinking about all these concepts and difficult ideas, it's easy as an artist to kind of be making work about it and critiquing and poking holes in things, but not necessarily offering like alternatives or finding ways to begin the processes of repair. Like, I can point out that I'm still a colonizer. I can point out, like, critique our use of land, but until I'm really able to generate something as an alternative, sometimes I felt like a hypocrite as an artist. The last thing I'll just sort of talk about, and Amy, I'm sure we'll have some questions about this, or we can talk about this, is the Vancouver Artist Labor Union Cooperative, or Value Co-op, which I helped start and I'm still continuing to work with, which is an artist cooperative. Well, we're a unionized cooperative that is meant to provide flexible living wage employment for artists. And it's a way to, a cooperative is a different business form. And so to me, it's a way to sort of fight market totalitarianism, and sort of try to push back against some of the like late stage capitalism and the dehumanizing effects of that, and try to start to think about other ways we can kind of operate, or other ways that we can make living wages and be able to support ourselves while not having such an impact on workers and the environment and the lands that we're on. So yeah, that's another thing that I'm involved in that I'm finding exciting and interesting and incredibly challenging at the same time. So yeah, I think I'll stop this sharing here, and maybe Amy and I can, I don't know, Amy, if you have questions about that, or kind of help me figure out how to pull some of those themes together.
For sure. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much, Emily, for your generosity with your talk. I think also sharing your trajectory of sort of where some of these ideas started out in your undergrad program and how you've been pulling, I'm going to use a textile metaphor, pulling the long thread of your work through time and spaces. It's a real treat to see. So thank you for that so much. This is the moment where I really miss being in person, because I'd be like, I just want a little round of applause before we move on. One of the things that I really appreciated about your talk, and you mentioned this briefly, was the idea of complicating some of these questions as opposed to simply pointing at them or trying to find answers that are like quick or facile, because I think that's also one of the jobs that we have as artists, is to not only be looking at and asking questions, but also, and staying curious, but also like, how do we complicate these topics? How do we problematize some of that? And I'm maybe going to bridge, you mentioned Value Co-op and the work that you're doing there towards the end of your talk with us. And this is maybe where we can start kind of looping in some of the work that you're doing within your practice and some of the interesting things that I've seen and been able to learn about with the Value Co-op. Because this is a question that I ask myself as well. And so this question comes from a place of like deep empathy and curiosity. We make things, like we make objects. You in particular, you sculpt, and you make objects out of material. And that material requires resources and spaces and access. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how some of the goals and missions that we can read about with Value Co-op maybe speak to or challenge or problematize your goals as an artist. And the framework that I'm applying to this is Value Co-op has an amazing set of missions that they publicize on their website. And one of them is, we aim to source materials and supplies produced ethically and which uphold environmentally sustainable practices. And as I mentioned, I asked this question from a place of deep curiosity. It's not a question of judgment or like a gotcha principle, but how do we ask that question mindfully about making things, making objects in the world, and trying to pursue that mindfully? I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's a really difficult question for me, and I struggle with it like all the time in my practice, because on the one hand, like I am using a lot of, like found materials, like found woods and but on the other hand, like I do, whenever I'm casting, I'm using like, silicone, rubber, and resins that are terrible for the environment and will live on in the landfill if, such a time comes for such a long time. And it's a constant battle, I think, because part of me is very much in the camp of this is not people's personal responsibility. Like
Yeah.
our personal responsibility is to make sure that the powers that be in our government and is setting up structures that support, you know, environmental change or a better care of the planet. But I've heard things like the 14 biggest shipping boats that cross the ocean create more CO2 than all of the cars on Earth. And so when you kind of get this like, oh, like we like to think that like if we buy electric vehicles, we're gonna like, but it isn't simple. There is no fix. There is this sort of slow process of thinking and repairing and just, so yeah, I sort of see Value Co-op as a vehicle for organizing as well, for
Hmm.
organizing a larger scale movements and that kind of a thing. Um, and I mean, we can't buy our way out of these problems. We can't buy our way out of capitalism. We can't buy our way out of these, and that's not really the approach. But at the same time, I do feel a certain sense of responsibility when I'm using materials in my studio, trying to talk about care for the land, and then I'm using these incredibly toxic resins or whatever. There's a funny, I mean, some of that is me kind of complicating it. Like I'm taking objects like birds' nests that are really just made out of like bird spit and mud and freezing them in this hard plastic that will never go anywhere. And that is part of the message, is like, look at how we love to do this. Look at how we love to like take, like just run away from rot. Like we just
Yeah.
hate it so much. And yet it's the basis of all life is rot. Like soil is rot. All these things are rot. And so yeah, I mean, I don't like, there's no answers in there. There's just all the things I'm thinking about. And just sitting in that uncomfortable place, I think is a bit of a practice as well, to just be like, this is uncomfortable. I don't have any answers. I'm just going to stay here and be uncomfortable and see how that, what kind of comes out of that.
Yeah, I really appreciate your honesty with that answer of kind of looking big scale of like how do we understand that individually we're participating in a much larger system, but then also that individual kind of rage against entropy that you bring forward of this like the desperate clutching desire to not let anything decay or to show a sense of passing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that I love that polarity in the work of looking that we're within your practice of looking very closely, intimately at a small scale and also something quite vast. I think the work that you're doing with soil in particular really speaks that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we've got a few questions popping up in the chat. Would you be willing to answer some of them? I can read
Sure, yeah.
them. Um, so we'll start. I'm just doing this purely in order of folks sending in their questions. So this question is actually from Adrian. Adrian's talked to you a bit about this before, Emily, but can you talk about the process by which you are able to gain access to the to be demolished homes in Vancouver, thinking particularly about the position of privilege for that access?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It's a, my family actually, my father is a home builder and they're now in the flooring and paint industry in Alberta. So I like to think I have like a code switching ability to talk to sort of developers and construction folks. So I do get permission for every house, farmhouses as well. I go and speak to the farmers, partially because I actually want some of the history of the stories of the places, and that kind of informs the work as well. But also I don't want to create any kind of like friction. Like I know that mainly the developers that I'm working with, they're just small family run businesses and they're not the man. Um, so I want to respect them as well and respect their work. So I do go. So I have I have several methods. At first, I just phone and I email and I phone and I email and I phone and I email and I just bother them until it's easier to say yes than to continue to say no.
I am
Um,
aware of this tactic.
yes. But I also do, I have done, I think maybe this is a little bit what Adrian is referring to. I have done where I'll show up to their office and I'll wear like, steel-toed boots and like, and I'll often bring my child in tow so that they can sort of see that like I'm a mother. I'm not gonna like just trash the place or, but that is a bit of a privilege. Like I sort of have this, I use my like, white lady clout, as, this middle-aged mother, person to kind of gain access to these homes. And I think that um, I do just sort of talk to them a little bit, I get a little bit like, hey man, I use my like kind of construction voice and yeah, I've had luck. But I mean, I now have relationships with 3 or 4 builders that are, one of them is an aspiring painter and he's really great. He'll send me images of his like landscape paintings that he's doing. Like I've just developed friendships with these folks as well. So
Yeah. I think that one of the terms that you use that I think is really important is code switch.
yeah.
That idea of being able to kind of adopt vernacular and pass, as it
Yeah.
were, as part of a community. And what I'm interested in is that you're also building relationships. You're not just parachuting in and then being like, see ya, thanks for the access, but that a
Mm-hmm.
relationship is being built out of that, even though you've got a sneaky way of propping open the
Yeah.
door at the beginning.
Yeah, and I've sent images of the work to the previous homeowners. I've had people, I've had homeowners come and say, "Oh, I used to live in that house," and I'll send them images and they can print them and use them for free. I don't, like I don't, I try to kind of be a bit community minded for sure.
Hmm. Do you mind if we keep rolling through the chat?
Mhm.
Great. And so, folks, please feel free to, if you have a question, now is the time to type it in for sure. Don't wait. So, we've got a question from Emily. What is the most surprising thing you learned while researching your heritage? Did this affect your practice in any way?
Yeah, for sure. Like I've always kind of known I was Mennonite. I grew up going to church, well, not Mennonite church, but going to church and kind of that, and there's these interesting, I don't know if anyone, I'm sure that we have some Mennonites listening, um, because it isn't Abbotsford Talk, but um, there were sort of these myths that I was told a lot, like the fact that, Mennonites they were trying to force them to fight in the army and Mennonites are pacifists. And that's why we fled from Poland. And that's why, and kind of as I was doing my research, I realized that it's not really true. Like it was, the request was you can do military service or you can pay taxes. And the Mennonites, like there were outs. It wasn't like, oh, they were trying to force us to go against our beliefs and fight. It was like, no, we want you to just, be part of our country a bit more. And the Mennonites were like, no, now we're out, which is a very interesting kind of different sort of shift in the narrative. So I guess what I learned from that is, as we all kind of know, history is written by people with biases. And so it's kind of this really, um, we like to change the stories that we tell. And
Mm,
yeah, so yeah, I think it did kind of affect my practice and just like how I look at things. And again, it's just complicating things and not having just like a single narrative that kind of goes from A to B, but that there's just this complicated mash of, everything. Just like our lives, but when we tell people the story of our lives, we edit out a whole bunch, and so trying to unedit those things is um, kind of one of
yeah.
the things. Yeah.
I think that really comes back to that idea of complicating and problematizing rather than assuming written stories or written histories. This is something that in working with community arts practices and my class members, really thinking about archival and recorded histories as a record of perspective.
Mm.
And I think that's something that is also really interesting to see within the work that you're making. Um, this kind of relationship of both expanding and collapsing, that idea of site as a record. Um, we have one more, actually two more questions in the chat. Are you okay to keep going?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So we have a question from Chelsea. Have you ever come across, worked, or created art with a space you have a previous relationship or memory with?
Hmm. It's a great question. I don't think I actually have. I went into lots of homes when, as a like a youth, but by the time I kind of got to making this art, most of those houses were gone. But I have a lot of times I gain access to these houses because I have one group of houses that my aunt actually found in her farming community in Eastern Alberta. Another one is a friend. So I do get a lot of history from others about them, but not personally. But I did, even in Saskatchewan, I went to a ladies' dice night and like sat with a bunch of farming ladies and played dice as I was trying to, and learned about some of the histories of the houses. But I don't have any personal. I would love like part of the whole Vancouver conundrum is if I did own my own house, I would love to kind of do the like Gordon Matta Clark thing where you kind of make artwork out of your own house, but
Yeah.
unfortunately I'm just a renter. And so,
I mean, you, me, and 98% of the
I
rest
know.
of people.
Totally.
I hear you. I'm so glad to hear that relationship between Gordon Matta Clark, because that's something, if folks are tuning in and that's an unfamiliar artist to you, I really encourage you, especially after this talk, to have a look at how I think what I'm so interested in the pairing of your work and Gordon Matta Clark's work is that with your work, I see a kind of investigation or curiosity about site itself, not just like what has been built or what has been fabricated and how to kind of collapse or expand that object as a
Yeah.
sculptural site, but really taking into consideration place as a kind of keeper of history and memory and time.
Yeah.
And I think that sensitivity to me speaks volumes about the kind of mindfulness that you're bringing forward with your practice.
Mhm.
Folks, we have time for maybe one more question. We've got one here from Megan. Um, so Megan says, "Hi, Emily, thanks so much for being here today. I'm so intrigued by your work. How do you think your works will function in the future as things continue to change? Do you think their impact will be the same, or will it change in terms of meaning as time goes on?"
Yeah, that's a great question. I think art's meaning always changes with time. I think that like there's sort of like the part of it that is like of the moment, but then it kind of gets reinterpreted kind of throughout time and history. And I think for sure, like, you think of someone like Fred Herzog who's taking photos in the 60s and 70s, and photos were pretty plain, but now they're this kind of amazing record of a certain time. And I think that there will be some of that, um, like this idea that uh, there's a record of a time. So those photos will become a bit of a record of a time, especially as these farming houses are gone or these houses in North Vancouver are gone. It's sort of a record of a time. And hopefully, at some point, this crazy tearing down houses and building new ones slows down a bit. And then this will be kind of a record of that. And we can kind of look back at the history of Vancouver and see how things have changed, look at the farms across, the prairie, see how things have changed. Um, from the time I took the photo or the time the house was built, time I took the photo to the, future kind of a thing. Yeah, I
Mm.
think that there hopefully there's more, if they don't change, it sort of means that they've sort of lived their day and they're done. But I hope that they kind of can continue to bring new meaning and new relevance kind of into the future.
Mhm. Um, we do have a couple of questions. Uh, Megan has a follow-up, which I think is interesting. So I'm going to ask this one. Um, do you see yourself altering decrepit skyscraper apartments way into the future? So there is a kind of romanticism in some of the architecture that you've chosen
Yeah,
to intervene in. And that's actually one of like, I had my stock questions ready
right.
to go.
Yeah.
And so I think that's also a great question, Megan, of like, what does this intervention look like if we're reflecting possible futures?
Yeah. I actually apartment buildings are something that I'm desperately currently still trying to get into. This is something that I'm really interested in doing. I would love to work in an apartment building or some kind of multi house space, like whether that's townhomes or whatever. Yeah, I think that would be just great. I think that, kind of like piercing through different units and whatever would be a really interesting kind of a look at how densification works and how we're living kind of a thing. And I do like, I think like it is difficult to not romanticize for sure, like especially the old farmhouses. It's really challenging. And I do try to actually pick plain houses. Like I don't try to work in like really beautiful heritage spaces very often.
Mm,
The one exception being that one house with the wainscoting but that was a Eaton's house, so you could actually order those houses in a catalog.
yeah.
So I did work in that one because they are quite plain. Like people who live on the prairie see them all over, and they were quite a like almost like a prefab sort of a situation, but they have a certain romanticism in our visual, um, how they look as well. But I do try to not choose the really nice heritage houses. I do try to choose very kind of even ugly houses, like houses that it's like it's okay that this house is going down, like it's good, it's fine, and then what you kind of can't see in the photos, which is how it stinks and they're rotting and everything is filthy, and I try to kind of like in that pink room with the flowers on the wall, there's actually a dead bird under the bed, and I try, like I think by having these photos large, like I don't think you can maybe notice it on the screen, but when you see it large, it doesn't look as cute as it looks in the image. Like you're like, oh, like, so yeah, I think that's kind of an important piece of the puzzle too.
For sure. We have, and this is maybe an opportunity for us to kind of transition into closing. We have a question about if you have like a more commercial aspect of your practice where folks, if they're interested in prints or if you make any of your images available commercially, is that something that's a part of your practice?
Not, no, not right now. I don't know. Like, I think I'm still trying to figure out how that would look. And so I'm at this point, I haven't worked out how to do that. But people can feel free to send me an email and, we can have a chat. But yeah,
And if folks
not so
want to
far.
get a hold of you, how would they reach you?
My email address is just my name, emilyneufeld@gmail.com. People can email me. My website is emilyneufeld.com as well. So, yeah.
And folks can find that email address if you're, for whatever reason, if you're just like, I can't remember, that is actually part of the poster for the advertisement for the Eventbrite link. So you can always flip back to that. Value Co-op also has a great website. I highly encourage folks to check it out. And as we sort of close the talk, I just want to once again say thank you so much for your generosity with us today. I also want to thank the audience for participating and asking such thoughtful questions. It's, as you mentioned in your talk, remember flying? Remember when we got to gather together in groups? I'm really grateful that we could have you visit with us today, despite the lack of physical contact and connection. I think it's really a treat to be able to visit with you and get to know your practice better today. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really lovely. And thank you for all the very thoughtful questions, both Amy from you and from the participants. It was really a nice way to spend my morning.
Awesome. Well, on that note, folks, we're going to close things 2 minutes early, just so that folks can get to the other places that they might need to go. I am going to start up in a few seconds, just a screen share of some acknowledgements and a thank you screen from the School of Creative Arts at the University of the Fraser Valley. We just want to recognize that both UFV, the School of Creative Arts, and the Reach Gallery Museum were co-hosting this event. And we're so grateful that you could join us today. So thank you, participants. And thank you so much, Emily Neufeld.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon.